What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video, and this one is about to absolutely blow your mind. So we're going to be speaking about the murder back in 1981 of Sister Tadea Benz in Amarillo, Texas, and then the execution of a man named Johnny Frank Garrett, who was the person that was ultimately accused of the murder and sexual assault. And while I've definitely dabbled, obviously, on my channel, speaking about all these things and my fair share of botched investigations and questionable convictions and shoddy police work, this one definitely takes things to an entirely new level. There is so much controversy surrounding this case. There's been a documentary made out of this. There has been a thriller movie made out of this. And even one of the first things that pops up on Google when you search Johnny Frank Garrett is, quote, "Is the Johnny Frank Garrett story true?" Because the entirety of my research, I could not believe half the things that I was reading. So buckle in, it's going to be a long video. Let's jump into this. So this case takes place in Amarillo, Texas on Halloween of 1981, and it takes place at a very unexpected place within Amarillo, and that was St. Francis Convent. So that morning, 6:30 a.m. on Halloween, the nuns of St. Francis Convent all woke up to their typical morning buzzer, and they gathered in the chapel for morning mass. And Sister Angela Martinez, who was at this mass, realized that her really close friend and sister, Sister Tadea Benz, was not attending. And Sister Tadea Benz was 76 years old. She had been a nun for most of her life. She was like a Swiss nun, whole line of nuns, essentially. She was not one to skip out on chapel. And so this was definitely something that seemed a little bit off to Angela Martinez. So she decided when mass ended around 7:30 a.m. that she was going to make her way to the second floor where all of the nuns had their bedrooms and check on Sister Tadea Benz. Now, as she approached Sister Benz's door, she immediately noticed another thing that just didn't seem right. Sister Benz's door was completely closed. One thing Sister Angela Martinez knew was that Sister Benz was very hard of hearing. She always kept her bedroom door cracked at night when she was sleeping so that she could hear out for the morning buzzer or anything else going on within the convent that she needed to be able to wake up and get moving for. And so seeing this door shut, Sister Angela Martinez knew that something probably wasn't quite right. And when she opened the door to check on her friend, what she found was absolutely heartbreaking. Sister Tadea Benz was on the floor of her bedroom, lying on her back completely naked, and both of her arms were outstretched to her sides. Now, right away, Sister Martinez called to other nuns in the convent to come and help her. And they all ended up coming to the conclusion that Sister Tadea Benz had likely just died from an accidental fall, and they even considered that she died of natural causes. Maybe she rolled and fell off of her bed. Maybe she had a heart attack. They were not thinking at all at the moment this could involve foul play of any sort of kind. So the first thing they decided to do was wrap her up to respect her in a sheet. And then they called the funeral home that they frequently use to have her transported there to start the embalming process, and then they would just move on from there. So no red flags in their brain so far, and they went about their day until an hour later at 8:30 a.m. when Sister Florentine was in the community room and noticed another thing that just didn't seem right. In the community room, there was a set of big windows, like two large window frames right beside this exit door. And Sister Florentine noticed that one of these windows had been completely shattered and the screen had been very clearly cut open. Someone had at some point broken into the convent. So at the time, it seems they were still trying to keep a more positive mindset. So they didn't make any connection whatsoever between this potential break-in that they're finding evidence from and the death of Sister Benz. So they just called Amarillo police and only reported that someone had likely broken into the convent and they wanted police to come and check out the situation. So Amarillo police arrived at 9 a.m. They began to investigate. They went into this thinking, okay, break-in, whatever, we'll figure this out. And as they were doing so, they started to overhear these whispered conversations between the nuns, like secretive, quiet conversations about the death of another sister, Sister Benz. And now, for some unknown reason, the nuns apparently just seemed hesitant to speak to the police at all about Sister Benz's death. They obviously had not wanted to bring it up when they reported the break-in, but obviously once police started hearing about this information, they're like, hold the phone, stop everything that we're doing. You need to tell us more information because these two things could potentially be connected here. When police began to ask the sisters, why they failed to mention the death of Sister Benz that morning, one nun stated, quote, "In my mind, I thought of it, but I took it for granted, as did the others, that she died a natural death." And then Sister Martinez, who had found Sister Benz, who had noticed the closed door, did actually tell police that closed door to her was in fact a red flag. She said, quote, "I knew it was not Sister Tadea's doing, but I could not think further. It was too much for me. I was in shock." So it seems like most of the sisters just genuinely didn't want to believe anything odd could have happened. I mean, after all, they're in a place that they believe is like a safe place for them, a convent. So the idea that it was possible someone could have broken in and then killed Sister Tadea just was something that they could not wrap their head around. The nuns began to explain to police everything that they had done at this potential crime scene in Sister Tadea's bedroom. They said that they had wrapped her up. They told police everyone who had touched her. They said that they had her transported to a funeral home. And they also told police that there had been droplets of blood all over the floor, and they had also gone to clean those up. So we already have a body that has been transported away from the potential crime scene. We have the partial cleanup of a potential crime scene. We have multiple people that have entered a potential crime scene. And so you can see how already from the get-go in this case, there's so much that's going wrong. Granted, hindsight's 2020, they didn't know at the time. So immediately the police call up this funeral home and find out that not just was the crime scene potentially contaminated, but Sister Tadea's Ben's body had already been partially cleaned and the embalming process had already been started. So they immediately halt everything that's going on and go to retrieve her body to take it into their custody. They drop her body off to Dr. Ralph Erdman, who was a newly hired full-time medical examiner for Potter County, and he was the one who performed the autopsy. Before even performing the autopsy, just from what everyone was able to visibly see, Sister Tadea Benz had obviously been murdered. Sister Benz had internal and external trauma. It was clear that she had been sexually assaulted. I've even seen it described as her experiencing a very, very forcible rape, which is just devastating. She had stab wounds all the way from her left upper thigh to her neck, so like all the way up her body. She had been mutilated. There were different abrasions and things on her neck that were indicative of strangulation, which ultimately ended up being found as her cause of death. She also had what was described in the autopsy as, quote, knuckle marks on her head, as if someone had repeatedly hit her. Her left eye was black, and I'm not going to show photos of her remains for very obvious reasons, but they are out there, and it wasn't just like a, very faint black eye. It was like the entirety of this area around her left eye, and she had been mutilated with the knife. This was an incredibly brutal murder, and again, I just don't understand how it wasn't so obvious when she was originally found. But regardless of that, an investigation continued back at the convent as she's having an autopsy done. And police did manage, thankfully, to gather quite a few bits of evidence from the crime scene, from around the convent, and then ultimately from Sister Benz's body. So there were black curly hairs that were found at the crime scene. They were, I believe, vacuumed and swept up off the floor right under where Sister Tadea Benz had been found. There were also hairs found on Sister Tadea's body that did not match her own, as well as inside of her mouth. There was a knife that ended up being found underneath of the bed, and police considered that that could be a potential murder weapon that had been left behind. And then they also found a second knife in the driveway of the convent. They took as many samples as possible from Sister Benz herself. They were able to gather semen samples. They were able to gather nail clippings, anything possible that could contain any sort of evidence. But do keep in mind, this is 1981. DNA testing was not a thing yet. They also took all of the linens from her rooms, like the bed sheets, any of the clothing that she had been wearing. There was, I believe, like a light blue nightgown that had blood on it. So I don't know if she was stabbed and then it was taken off of her or what exactly happened. They also found a white men's V-neck t-shirt that was crumpled up and had been kind of tossed beside her body. They also found that underneath the window that had been broken into, there were quite a few footprints that very likely belonged to whoever committed this horrendous act. So to start a possible suspect list, to figure out who on earth would break into a convent and do this to a nun, police began to canvass the area and ask anybody and everybody questions. Right away, they managed to get a critical lead that was valid enough and important enough for them to totally chase it down as the first possibility. So one of the security guards around the convent said that the night prior, which would have been the 30th of October into the 31st, it was right around midnight, and he said he was patrolling the grounds when he noticed a man hiding behind a tree. Upon closer investigation, he described this man as having like black curly afro style hair, and it appeared that he was possibly Cuban. And this security guard went to figure out why this guy was lurking around the convent grounds, and as he approached him, the guy took off running, and unfortunately the security guard was never able to catch him. Now, not just that, after this strange occurrence, when police spoke to a handful of nuns in the convent, one of them also had something strange happen just like an hour and a half after this. Sister claimed that at around 2:30 a.m., a phone call came into the convent. And when she picked up, there was a male on the other end. She described him as having a very, very heavy Spanish accent. And he kept stating that he needed help, that he needed to speak to the priest about his sexual desires. And when she repeatedly was like, "We can't do this right now," this man, I guess, just kept repeatedly asking, "Can you help me? Can you help me?" Just kind of a weird, eerie phone call. And there were apparently other witnesses in the area as well that claimed seeing a Cuban man hanging out in the area the day prior. So this is really what they set their sights on. And they also realized while digging into this murder that they possibly had something even bigger on their hands, and even considered for a while that they were dealing with a serial killer. So to give you a better understanding of Amarillo at the time, which is something incredibly important to understand, murder and capital murder were just at an all-time high. Amarillo was not a great and safe place. And even to this day, they are ranked as one of the most dangerous metropolitans in the US. So clearly there's still an issue there. And the entire community basically just was in a state of unease. They didn't feel safe. On top of that, there had been massive issues with things like corruption in the police department, multiple botched capital murder investigations, and just murder investigations in general. There were a lot of issues with trials, mistrials, and according to different law enforcement that, was in the area at the time in interviews with them, the police department basically in Amarillo and surrounding areas, they did not cooperate with each other. There was no communication between departments, and it was even so bad that the police departments were competing, and so they wouldn't share information and they wouldn't ask for help because it was I'm going to solve this first and you aren't going to get to take claim for it type of deal. And we all know when you've got a situation like that with a crime, it's not good. Basically, these departments turned it into a gigantic pissing contest. There wasn't evidence that was being shared in massive cases. It was a rough time. So in order to hopefully solve these issues, City Manager John Stiff brought on a new police chief in February of 1981. His name is Jerry Neal. So Jerry Neal did go on to do a handful of really great things. He created the Potter Randall County Special Crimes Unit to basically force these different counties to come together and share information and communicate. He created different community outreach programs, and this was really the first kind of big murder case under his watch. So there was a lot of pressure, a lot of very high expectations. And on top of that, there was also a newly elected DA, a man named Danny Hill. His entire campaign was basically around him saying there would be swift justice. He was saying he was going to use the death penalty more often. He was going to try to stop crime to the best of his abilities. When he came into office, there were 10 pending capital murder cases in Amarillo. That's like absolutely asinine to have that many pending capital murder cases. So just like Jerry Neal, there was a lot of pressure and expectations when it came to Danny Hill, the DA, and how they acted and what they did. And so one of the first things that Danny Hill did was he personally chose and hired a new full-time medical examiner, Ralph Erdman, the pathologist that performed the autopsy on Sister Benz. This was supposed to fix everything. This was supposed to help Amarillo feel safe. And so this was really their first opportunity to prove that they were going to do what they said, essentially. So one thing that scared the police department was that there was an eerily similar case that happened months prior. Where a woman was sexually assaulted and murdered. And not just that, in those past few months, there had been like 10 plus sexual assaults all within this area, like break-in sexual assault, over and over and over again. Police were worried they had a serial rapist who was turning to a serial rapist and murderer, so this was a lot. On July 8th, 1981, police had been called to check on 77-year-old Narnie Bryson. She lived in a home on North Houston Street in Amarillo, and someone close to her had been trying to contact her for like, I believe, an entire day, and she wasn't answering any phone calls. It was completely unlike her, so police went to check on her. And when they got there, they immediately felt something was wrong because there was an old newspaper from the day before still sitting in the driveway, and there was no answer at the door. They made their way into the home. They ended up finding Narnie on the bed. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, mutilated, and strangled. She was sent to the medical examiner, evidence was collected, and an investigation began. This murder was so brutal, just like Sister Benz's, to the point where Narnie had broken multiple bones during the struggle with whoever did this to her. And according to multiple statements that were made from the police department by both Danny Hill and the sergeant at the time, stated that evidence from both Narnie's murder and assault and Sister Benz's murder and assault seemed to be consistent. They repeatedly told the news that it was very similar. It was, quote, too similar. And so it was believed that whoever murdered Narnie also murdered Sister Benz. And so they were looking for one person responsible for both murders. And to give you an idea of how incredibly identical these crime scenes were, both homes had been broken into the same way. Well, a home and then a convent. A screen of a window had been cut through, window had been broken, and the person gained access that way. Again, both women were mutilated, sexually assaulted, and strangled. White t-shirts were found beside the body at both crime scenes. And to me, that's like one of the things that stands out the most. That's not something that you commonly find, just the same kind of men's style white v-neck t-shirt. Both of them were part of religious groups, as I'm sure you've gathered at this point. Sister Benz was part of a Roman Catholic church, and Narnie was part of the Buchanan Street United Methodist Church. At both scenes, black curly hair was found, and just like at Sister Benz's crime scene, a neighbor actually saw someone they described as a possible Cuban male hanging out around Narnie Bryson's home prior to the murder. Also, both women performed volunteer work regularly. Both crimes were only a few blocks away from each other. So you can see how incredibly similar both of those cases are. And this brings us to another incredibly important point about this time period. So in early 1980, President Jimmy Carter said, quote, "Ours is a country of refugees." And this was stated in the midst of an ongoing battle between Jimmy Carter and Fidel Castro. So at the time, Cuba was dealing with an economic crisis. Foreign trade was just like absolutely tanking in their country. People that had once fully supported the Cuban Revolution were now frantically trying to get the heck out of there. And the United States was basically attempting to convince Castro to open his borders, to let those that wanted to flee, to seek asylum, to leave. That was kind of the goal. And on May 1st, 1980, unexpectedly to everyone, Fidel Castro agreed. He said that he was going to open the port of Mariel for 6 months, and that was it. And basically any Cuban that wanted to go was free to go if they could find their own transportation. President Carter had initially stated he would grant 3,500 Cubans asylum, but that's not at all how it went. In total, I believe it was over 125,000 Cubans ended up leaving the island and just flocked to southern Florida for their safety. They were renting shrimp boats and fishing boats. It was like whole flotillas. They were creating rafts. I mean, you name it. These people were desperate to get out of Cuba to come to the United States. So the United States is scrambling to figure all of this out and take in this many people unexpectedly. And Castro saw this as an opportunity. He's like, okay, fine. You want my people, you get my people. And he opened every prison. He opened every single mental institution and deported 20,000 inmates and patients to the United States. There was this massive influx in refugees coming into Florida, and pretty much everyone was scrambling to place them throughout the United States. So lots of different churches and nonprofit organizations, and so many people came down to basically take some of the refugees and take them back to their hometown, place them with families that they can live with, get a roof over their head, help them get a job. And unfortunately, not knowing it, a lot of these individuals were taking in like career criminals. And I'm not talking like petty small crimes. I'm talking murderers, like serial killers, serial rapists, people from cartels. And one of the locations that a lot of these refugees ended up was Amarillo. A lot of places were seeing an uptick in the rate of crime. And so police were like, you know what? We could possibly have one of these criminals that have been released in our community. So we're going to track down every single Cuban refugee to question them. And so I can't remember exactly how many it was. I think it was like a little over 100 different individuals were brought in. They were questioned, collected DNA from them, blood samples, checked their criminal history in the US. 2 of them pulled up criminal records. And so these were 2 potential suspects, especially given what their crimes were. So it was a man named Fernando Flores and another man named Leoncio Perez Rueda. So both men, coincidentally, just 2 weeks after the murder of Narnie Bryson, were caught peeking into elderly women's windows. And it was like in the exact same neighborhood. And Rueda, from my understanding, when he was caught, like he was at this older woman's window, fully stripped down, like totally naked, ready to go in there and likely sexually assault her. And so clearly there was something going on there with this. And to add to the suspicion that one of these men could potentially be involved in these attacks, eyes ended up falling kind of on Rueda at first, because he actually lived on Van Buren Street with a Catholic family that had taken him in. So that's already a Catholic tie to the area. He was in that same neighborhood. And not just that, within hours of Sister Benz's murder, another woman had been attacked. She was sexually assaulted and attacked in the middle of the night, and thankfully, she ended up surviving, but when she kind of came to in the hospital, she couldn't remember a thing. And interestingly, this woman was attacked on the exact same street that Rueda lived on, Van Buren Street, with this Catholic family. So a lot of this is just way too convenient for police. While I don't believe that Flores was ever questioned about potentially being involved in Narnie's murder, and it seemed they only questioned Rueda about it, the tables were completely turned when it came to Sister Benz's murder. Police fully set their eyes on Fernando Flores, and they strongly believed that they had their guy, to the point where they collected his hair, blood, like all of that, and sent it off not just to their labs, but to the FBI for comparison to all of the samples that had been taken from Sister Benz. While all this is going on, I have seen that they put Flores in a lineup, and the security guards were even able to point him out and be like, that's the guy. So police were basically sitting there waiting on confirmation to press these charges. But on November 7th, so just a week after the murder, the FBI came back and said, sorry, but he's not the one. They had compared all of the hair samples, everything possible, and there was no match. Flores could not have possibly been the killer of Sister Benz. And so instead of being like, okay, Possibly, could it have been Rueda, the other person that we already identified as being a potential suspect, the other person committing similar crimes? Instead of looking at him, bringing him in and questioning him, they instead basically throw in the towel and start to become desperate. The energy at the time, because they had not made an arrest yet. They had not seemingly made any progress. After announcing they had someone that they believed to be involved, they had to go turn around, tuck their tail between their legs, and say, we made a premature conclusion here. There was a, quote, lynch mob energy throughout the town. Everyone was angry. There had been all these promises made. They had been told that the killer had been caught. And so there was a lot of pressure on Jerry Neal and Danny Hill. And so again, desperation seemed to come into play. So as I stated, on Van Buren Street, just within hours of Sister Tadea Benz's murder, there had been another attack. And so police went to find this woman and decided, okay, she doesn't have any information. We'll try to get information out of her. So they hypnotized her. Absolutely nothing came out of it. So they're like, okay, this didn't work. We've got to find something else. And now I don't know if they approached this clairvoyant themselves or if she came to them, but they ended up working with a woman named Inez Patterson, aka Bubbles, and she claimed to have had a vision. So this relationship with Bubbles was kind of like odd just to begin with, because again, I don't know if they approached her, which could have pushed her to go find information, or if she genuinely approached them with information, not having anything else. She had worked with them before. Her boyfriend, his name was like Heavy Duty, was a drug dealer in Amarillo and also a snitch/informant. So you kind of have like a weird dynamic already happening there. And then what she says that she envisioned was also ridiculously specific. So she told police that just days after the murder, her vision showed a young man running away from the convent. And she said that he had large ears, an Abe Lincoln face, that he was very tall, like 5'11", somewhat muscular build. And she said that he was the one responsible for Sister Benz's murder. She also said very specifically that he lived at 4000 Northeast 18th Street, which was like directly across from the convent, and also gave the name of Mr. Clyde, which all of this has come very heavily into speculation for multiple reasons. First of all, we have a psychic, and I hate to burst any bubbles for those out there who heavily rely on them. Unfortunately, despite their good intentions, more often than not, they've only caused more harm than good when they have participated in these sorts of investigations. You cannot corroborate a lot of the things that they say. And it's very easy sometimes for people to pretend that they know things simply from information that they gather, which seemed very possible in this situation because this was a very specific address. Again, anyone who knew what happened at the convent could have driven around and found this. It was a corner lot, like super easy to pick out. And this name, Mr. Clyde, literally painted on the side of a doghouse, very large, like across the whole side. It was visible from the street if you were going around this house. So while police are like, she obviously was able to see all of this, a lot of people even to this day are like, she's full of crap. So regardless, police are like, all right, well, this is like our next step. We've already screwed up and got the first suspect wrong. She could have some sort of knowledge. Let's go and check this out. And so they look up who lives in the home and head out to the area. And it's actually someone that a few of the officers recognized. A 17-year-old tall, lanky boy named Johnny Frank Garrett. Now, he had a handful of run-ins with the law before, nothing ridiculous. I think it was like a few thefts and then vandalism, nothing violent or anything like that. And so a few officers had mentioned this and they said, you know what? He has a doghouse in the back of his yard that says Mr. Clyde on it. So this was right. And he matches the description. So clearly this clairvoyant knew what she was talking about. This has to be our guy. So police are at the home trying to talk to Johnny Frank Garrett and he's not there. So they leave a message and head on back to the station. But because they feel so confident in what this clairvoyant said and it's so perfectly matched up to what they found, they're like, you know what? Because he's had a criminal record before, we have his fingerprints. Let's match them to the fingerprint found on the headboard of Sister Benz's bed and the knife that was found under her bed that they believed was the potential murder weapon. And sure enough, it is a hit. And so they're like, done. This is it. This is our guy. We're going to go back and arrest him. Now, mind you, he had actually called in once he got the message and got home. The police wanted to speak to him. He called into the police department and was like, okay, I'll be there the following day, which would have been November the 10th. And he was like, I will come in at 9 a.m., like right when you open. But police were like, we're not waiting. We have his fingerprints. Keep in mind, that's all they had. We have his fingerprints and we have what the psychic has said. We are arresting this guy. And so they head to the house with like a whole gaggle of police officers. There's like over a dozen officers. There's multiple news stations that have been told about this. They all show up at the house and they knock, and Charlotte, who is Johnny's mom, answers the door. And she's obviously like, what on earth is going on? Why are there all these officers? Why are there all these big lights and cameras in my face? And the police don't even say, oh, well, we are arresting your son because we believe he's potentially involved in the murder of the nun. Instead, they tell her, okay, we actually are going to book him for the theft of a truck, which I think was like maybe a warrant that he had out for him. And so his mom at this point is like, okay, like you're arresting him on a warrant for stealing a truck. Like he's been in trouble before. Here he is. But like she's also still very confused as to why that warranted all of those police officers and the news to be there. Johnny's put into the back of a cop car and he is taken to be questioned at the police station. And so Charlotte sits down at her house and the news comes on like immediately after this. And right away, the first thing that is said on the news is that police in Amarillo had arrested the person they believed to be responsible for the murder of Sister Tadea Benz. And Charlotte isn't even connecting the two. And so she's like, oh my God, my neighbors are all going to think that he's the one who did it because there were all these cameras and all of these people. What am I going to tell everyone? And then as she's in this panic, she gets a phone call from her sister. And her sister's like, I can't believe this. Like, I can't believe they're accusing him of this. And she's like, accusing him of what? On another news station, it had been announced that Johnny Frank Garrett was the one that police had brought in regards to the murder of Sister Tadea Benz. And so Charlotte's like, wait a minute, that's not what they told me. Something here is not right. And so she rushes to the police station. Now, back at the police station, 17-year-old Johnny had been taken for questioning without a family member present, without a lawyer present. They read him his Miranda rights, and everything at this point is being like videotaped, audio taped, everything that they were supposed to do. So the Miranda rights being read, that's captured. All the original conversation with Johnny is captured. And initially, he completely denied having any knowledge of the murder of Sister Tadea Benz. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's very clearly confused. He denies having any sort of involvement. A few different officers went in and out to try to speak to him, and after an hour of questioning, he was still maintaining his innocence. And for some reason, after this hour of him maintaining his innocence, a new investigator goes in to speak with him. Somehow during this time, the recording is completely shut off, and after 10 minutes, that same investigator comes out and says, we've got a confession. So according to this investigator, during this 10 minutes, I guess like they had confronted him saying, you know, we've got your fingerprints there and all these things. And he just willingly started to tell them exactly what had happened. And before starting to confess, he initially said he wanted to confess to the DA only, and they said, no, you can't do that. And so then after like partially telling the story, he said, you know what, I want a lawyer. And so at that point, they should have stopped asking him questions. But for some reason, another investigator went in after this, after admitting in the police records, admitting that he had been told that Johnny had asked for a lawyer. This investigator went in anyways and proceeded to continue asking him what had happened that night. And after Johnny gives him this confession, he's like, oh, well, Johnny, I thought you said you wanted an attorney. So according to officers, which again, there is no visual recording of this, there is no audio recording of this. Johnny didn't write his confession himself, which is not anything too crazy. Some people don't. But the officers typed up what they said he confessed. So essentially what they claimed was that Johnny said that he had heard the nuns had some nice radios in the convent. He decided that he was going to go and break into the convent. He said that he broke in through a window, went to the nuns' bedrooms, and this is when he went into Sister Tadea's room. And he claimed that she opened her eyes and like saw him there and went to scream, so he covered her mouth and then proceeded to strangle her, sexually assault her, car, and then he left the same way that he came in. It's like 8 lines of a confession, not a lot of details, literally not much to it at all. And despite them claiming that Johnny had given this confession, Johnny refused to sign the typed up copy of it. He said he was not signing it, that he never said any of that. Now, at this point, his mom arrives and is like, you need to take me to him. We need to get a lawyer. And they're like, it's too late for you, hon. He confessed. And she's like, there's no way that Johnny confessed to this because he did not do this. When she said that she told the officers, I don't know what's going on here, but something is wrong with what you're doing and you're not going to get away with this. And when she was finally allowed to go back and see Johnny, she claimed that he was hysterical. He said, I didn't do this. I'm innocent. So far we have a confession that is not recorded in any way, shape, or form. It was not signed by the person who they claim it came from. He never had any representation during any of this, and he had also already asked for a lawyer before giving it and being, continuously asked questions. And basically all the evidence they had at this point was circumstantial. They literally had fingerprints that matched him, and that was it. Despite all of this, he was still arrested and charged with the murder of Sister Tadea Benz. Something that is incredibly important to note about the situation is that Johnny had cognitive limitations. His IQ was well below 70. He had been described as an incredibly slow learner. He did not learn to read until after the 6th grade. So his comprehension of what was going on was probably very limited. So on top of that, he had a very traumatic childhood. And so his mental grounding really should have been questioned. So starting at a very, very young age, Johnny was sexually and physically abused by his stepfathers. There were, I think, 2, if not more of them. The stepfathers also began to prostitute him out to other men to make themselves money. At the age of 14, after years of this abuse, he was then forced into sex acts to create child films. If you're picking up what I'm throwing down, had a huge impact on his mental health and well-being and just his health in general. And so because all of this was going on, he started to, by the age of 10, rely on things like alcohol and drugs. And this was how he learned to cope. I mean, he was taught how to use things like paint thinner to get high. He was using amphetamines all the time. And ultimately, this ended up causing him a lot of brain damage and also furthered the struggles that he had with his mental health. And so already so much was wrong here. And while Johnny's mental state does not negate what police were claiming he did, it should have changed a lot in terms of how things were kind of handled throughout this. So right away, Johnny and his family began to reach out to lawyers left and right, anyone possible, to find him representation. And it seemed that no one would take him on. Now, that is what has been claimed in a handful of different articles, that he called repeatedly to different attorneys and they just didn't answer the phone. Letters that have been collected that Johnny had written, he claims that he had very specific lawyers that he found that he asked police to help him call, and the police essentially told him no. I don't know which way is the truth, but he couldn't find anyone. I do know that for a fact. And what's interesting is that while he's in the midst of trying to find all these attorneys and he's got no one to represent him, he's sitting in the police station after just giving a confession. All of a sudden, a man named Bill Coleus, that his mom didn't know, he didn't know, no one had called this man. He shows up acting like he completely knew what was going on and told Johnny to not answer any more questions, like acted as if he was his attorney. And at this point, obviously it was too late, but this was just something that kind of stuck out to Johnny and his family. In the following days, when he went on to his arraignment, he still had no representation. And at his arraignment, Johnny was explaining to the judge, like, look, this confession was not mine. This was something that I was basically coerced to do. He began to explain to the judge that his fingerprints were probably all over the convent because he frequently went there. He helped the sisters in the convent out a lot. He would go and look at the artwork. So he was like, this is completely circumstantial evidence, basically. His sister and his mom also spoke to the judge saying that they were an alibi for him, that he had been home that night playing checkers checkers with them. Ultimately, it seemed nobody was buying it. It didn't really matter. And so when the judge was like, this is going to proceed to trial, do you have any representation? When Johnny went to say, no, I haven't found any yet, up pops Bill Coleus in the back of the courtroom. And he's like, I'll take him on. Now, there is a lot of, I don't want to call it like conspiracy theories around this. I'll kind of get deeper into that towards the end, but a lot of people question this happening because Bill Coleus had never handled any criminal cases, from my understanding, at all prior to this point. You are allowed the right to proper representation in a situation like this. So your court-appointed attorney or whatever it may be needs to be someone who can properly represent you. And so this wasn't a good fit, but no one knew that, at least not Johnny. And he also didn't know that like he could have said, no, I don't want this guy. I don't know this guy. He keeps popping up here. I want these other attorneys. But the judge basically was like, oh yeah, sure, this works. Bang. And so Bill Coleus was the attorney. So the trial was going to proceed. And in a capital murder case, you also, as a defense, have to have 2 attorneys just to make sure that there is no stone left unturned. And so a man named Phil Jordan was brought on. Again, this was the choice of the judge. Phil Jordan had also never worked a murder case like this before, not a capital murder case at least. And interestingly, just weeks prior, he had been working in the office of Danny Hill, who was the DA and the prosecuting attorney. And like, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a conflict of interest. But I digress. Needless to say, this entire situation was incredibly chaotic. Over the next couple of months, like past the holiday season, according to Charlotte, Johnny's mom, every time she'd go to visit Johnny, he's like, do you know what's happening in my trial? Like, I cannot get any of my attorneys to answer my letters. I don't know what they're doing. Are they even helping me? What are my options? And so essentially it seemed like the defense wasn't doing much, at least in Johnny's opinion. And so his mom would go and meet with the attorneys, and this was only done like a handful of times. And she said that basically every time she met with them, they acted like this was a lost cause, that they weren't going to try too hard because there was no saving Johnny. It seemed that during this time, the one positive thing the defense did for Johnny, but they did file a motion to move the location of the trial. Everyone in Amarillo and all surrounding areas were very well aware of this case. That was the only thing that was on the news every single day, all day long. And Johnny and the defense were worried that he wasn't going to get a fair trial because there was no way, unless you lived under an actual rock, that you were going to not have any idea of any details about this case to come in without any sort of preconceived notions. But for some reason, the judge struck it down, said, nope, it's going to happen here. We're proceeding with the trial. And so the jury selection began, and this was just as much of a crap show as everything else had been up to this point. So Johnny's sitting there with his defense. This entire jury selection process went on for 31 days, and just like they thought, there was not a single person that came in that had no idea about the case. Everyone knew details. And on top of that, somehow all the jurors that were chosen, I don't know how they made it through. So there were jurors that were selected, and the defense somehow didn't strike down, that had multiple friends in law enforcement. So that can be problematic. They should have been struck down. Another juror that was selected had actually done business with the medical examiner, Dr. Erdman. So another issue here. And there was even a witness that was the nephew of a judge that would be the very first punishment witness brought to the stand if Johnny was found guilty. So like, we've got family members. It was just, I don't understand how on earth any of this managed to happen. Usually in a case like this where the defense or just lawyers in general feel defeat and like there's no way they can, bring forward a solid argument, at the very least, they try to be as obnoxious as possible by like striking down every single thing possible, striking down jurors, pleading insanity, doing whatever they possibly can, and it just doesn't seem like his defense attorney was even doing that. And so the trial began, and things just weren't at all looking good for Johnny, because the prosecution spent 5 days basically convincing the jury that this man was an absolute monster. They described him as a troubled teen, that he was incredibly dangerous, didn't need to be out in society, and they said he had a plan this night, that he wanted to go out and specifically kill this nun, and that if he were to ever be out of prison, that he would go on and continue harming people. And they never brought up a single time, it was never mentioned to jurors, that he was mentally disabled, that he had cognitive limitations, that he had this history of severe abuse and trauma. And his defense should have been there to pick up that slack. Again, normally if a defense has absolutely no actual defense, they'll at least plead insanity, not saying it's right, but they didn't even do that. They actually didn't order a mental health evaluation at all of Johnny, despite that being one of the largest issues that everyone had with him being charged and the way things were being handled. The prosecution also continued to say that there's this knife under the bed. His fingerprints are all over it. The knife in the driveway ended up matching a set of knives in Johnny's home kitchen. They're like, we've got these weapons, we've got these fingerprints. There's no other explanation other than he committed the crime, and they were pushing for the death penalty. When it came to Johnny's defense, they also did not hire an investigator, so the evidence that was being brought forward by the prosecution, they didn't have anything or any of their own experts to come forward and question any of that. I want people to remember while I'm describing this that it is innocent until proven guilty, and everyone has the right to a fair trial. And so the fact that he was so badly represented, regardless of if he did this or not, is not right. The defense also did not call any witnesses to the stand, which is almost unheard of in a capital murder trial. He was essentially left defenseless entirely. And the prosecution, still on the other hand, was just bringing forward witness after witness after witness to call Johnny into question. He had claimed that he had been home that night as his alibi from 10:20 on, didn't leave until the following morning. His family had confirmed this during the arraignment, but there was one neighbor that came forward saying absolutely not, he was at my home at 11, so there's no way he was home at 10:20. There was another neighbor that said, oh yeah, I've seen him before peeking around into other people's windows in the neighborhood. There was a police officer that said that they saw him the night of the 30th, just prior to the murders, outside of his home smacking a bush with a stick. So this was somehow used as evidence that he was like violent and aggressive and likely went from smacking a bush with a stick to somehow killing someone. The prosecution also brought forward a man named Lonnie, who was 18 years old at the time, and he was a known jailhouse snitch and informant, essentially. He claimed when he got up on the stand that he had lived in the same jail block as Johnny. He had spoken to Johnny quite a few times. He claimed that the first few times he asked Johnny what he was in there for, Johnny denied having anything to do with the murder of Sister Tadea Benz. And then he started to blame it on some random person, gave some random name as someone who did it. And then ultimately Lonnie said that Johnny confessed to him and said, I was the one who did it. This is what I did. Now, according to Johnny, however, he had never come in contact with this man, that Lonnie was in a cell on the complete opposite side of the block as him, and they just never crossed paths. He told his family and other people that if he had confessed to Lonnie, he would have had to scream from his cell all the way across to where Lonnie's cell was, and that is how he would have had to confess to him, meaning that everyone in that entire block would have had to hear it. That would have been the only possible way he could have confessed to Lonnie. But the jury never heard that. The jury never heard Johnny claim this because the defense never questioned or said a thing about it. There were so many different holes and things within the prosecution's case. Had the defense done their job, had the defense brought forward information that they should have, evidence that they should have, the jury would have been told that Johnny frequently visited the convent. But they weren't told that. From their understanding, the night of the murder was the only time Johnny had ever been there, which therefore clearly lays out the idea that The only explanation of how his fingerprints could have gotten there was if he committed the crime. But in reality, he frequently visited the convent. According to the bishop who was in charge of everything at that convent at the time, he knew Johnny very well, and so did the other nuns. He would frequently come in to admire the artwork. He would ask about the different crosses and all the different things that were there. The bishop even knew about his history and his abuse. And just prior to the murders, Johnny had actually come to the convent to help move furniture. According to the bishop, he was in every single nun's bedroom just prior to the murder, moving furniture around in and out of the rooms. The jury also wasn't told that while there definitely were these fingerprints that no doubt about it did match back to Johnny, there was another set of fingerprints found in Sister Benz's room. And they didn't match back to Johnny or anyone else in the convent. So who on earth did these fingerprints belong to? This immediately throws in reasonable doubt. On top of that, the jury was never told that there had been another suspect in the case, Fernando Flores, and that also could have thrown some questions into things. On top of that, the weapons were probably the one thing that had me confused as all get out most of the time that I was researching this. So this knife that they spoke about, this knife that was underneath the bed, that they completely based on the language they were using during this trial, made seem like it was the murder weapon. According to the FBI, it was not. The only thing that was found on this knife, which by the way was a bent butter knife, was mustard. That's literally it. And in the trial, the prosecution is like saying, did you take the knife? They're literally speaking about this butter knife they found. They're like motioning, stabbing motions, and asking Johnny, is this what you did to her neck? With this butter knife that they know for a fact, thanks to FBI testing, was not ever used to stab Sister Benz. On top of that, there also is no biological matter on the steak knife that they found out in the driveway. So again, we're back to the fact that the only evidence they seem to have was that his fingerprints were on it. And clearly, according to multiple witnesses, if they had ever made it to the trial, could have easily said those could have gotten on there a number of different ways from the dozens of times that Johnny came in here. The black curly hair that was also found in the room was described in the trial as being consistent with Johnny's hair. However, the results by the FBI, which I have seen, all of these documents are on a website that I will have linked down below. It's called thelastworddocumentary.com. The FBI found that the results were inconclusive. So they could not even say if these were from Johnny or if they were not, but the prosecution certainly swayed it to make it seem like they were, because they kept saying these are consistent. The reality is that they were not a match. And on top of that, there were also these unexplained hairs in her mouth and on her body, and those did not match Johnny. The jury also was never told about this white V-neck t-shirt that had been left behind, not just at Sister Benz's murder, but at the very similar murder of Narnie Bryson, a case that they also had never heard about. They were never told about the Cuban man that had ran from security at the convent that night, or the phone call that came in at 2:30. Speaking of Narnie Bryson, police had said it's literally in interviews with them from 1981 in newspapers that these were too similar. Yet they never questioned Johnny a single time about Narnie Bryson's murder at all. And you would have thought that that's one of the first things they would have done. So the jury that had clearly not at all been handed over all the evidence, they had not been told the full story at all, ended up finding Johnny Garrett guilty, and he was sentenced to death, and his execution date was set for January 6th, 1992. And one of the most heartbreaking things that I've heard was some of the things that happened during this time and immediately after his sentencing. Danny Hill, the DA, who had made all these promises to have swift justice and said he would use the death penalty as often as possible, basically. Him and a whole bunch of other people from the DA's office apparently showed up to this last day of trial, to the jury reading the verdict with plastic syringes. And they were like playing around with them as a joke. I really just don't know how you can get any more unprofessional and messed up as that. I really don't. And after the verdict was read and Johnny's family had to hear that at 17 years old, their loved one was being sentenced to death over something that they all fully believed he did not do. His mom ran out of the courtroom in hysterics. She was absolutely devastated, and she closed herself into a bathroom stall so she could be alone, as probably anyone would want to be. And a freaking reporter from NBC News followed this woman into the woman's bathroom, threw her camera over the top of the stall, and filmed and photographed Charlotte at that point in time, probably one of her lowest points in life, to sell it. And that, as well as these plastic syringes, is some of the most disgusting information that I have ever heard. And while so many people in Amarillo saw that this was justice at last, they're like, finally, we have a solid conviction. These people came through with their promises. We feel safer. Like, how dare you do this to a nun? There were still a ton of people that also were like, this isn't right. There's something going on here. And they decided to stand and fight. Now, when you are sentenced to the death penalty, there is an automatic appeal and habeas corpus that's filed. And so Johnny at this point was like, forget it. I'm fighting with everything that I have. And so he began to speak to the court during these appeals to fight for himself. He claimed that he could explain the knife having his fingerprints on it and the headboard. Not only could he say he was there all the time, and that's how fingerprints could be there, but he could specifically tell them why his fingerprints were on the knife and the headboard. And so, according to this document, he claimed that a couple nights before the murder, he decided to break into the convent. He had theft charges before, so this isn't anything out of the norm for him. And he claimed that he walked into the convent around noon one day. He came in through the front door, and he said that he went to the cafeteria and to the kitchen area and ended up grabbing a butter knife from one of the drawers before heading up to the second floor, where he planned to try to break into different chests and drawers in the nuns' rooms to try to steal things from him. I think he planned on stealing like some crucifixes, some crosses, things along those lines, which, mind you, when he was picked up on November the 9th, police did end up finding crucifixes and pieces of jewelry in his possession, and I don't know if they ever tried to figure out if these crucifixes came from the convent. We know his defense didn't do it. His defense didn't ask anything about the convent, didn't speak to the nuns, didn't speak to the bishop, did not even know that Johnny regularly went to the convent because they also didn't speak to Johnny. Anyways, so he claimed that he went to steal all of these things, and that while in one of the rooms, he ended up bending the butter knife that he had been using while trying to break into one of the drawers. And so he tossed it to the ground, and he is saying this is how that one butter knife ended up getting under Sister Tadea's bed. In the same room, after he realized he could not get into the chest or the drawers, he said that he saw a cross up on the wall, and he wanted to potentially grab that. So he put his hand on the headboard and leaned over to grab this cross, but he heard a noise, so he frantically left the convent. So this could very easily explain all of this evidence that, again, the prosecution was saying was just absolutely damning, convincing evidence that he was the one who murdered Sister Benz. And they ended up bringing a lot of people to argue this. So I guess there was a nun that ended up coming forward, and basically she said that there was no way Johnny could have broken into the convent or even walked through the front door at around noon during the middle of the day. She said around that time was their lunchtime, so the fact that he was claiming he went to the kitchen, to the cafeteria, that someone would have seen him had he been there. Also stated that none of the nuns had reported anything missing. So maybe those crucifixes were not one of the nuns, but again, I have never seen law enforcement actually confirm that or any of the attorneys investigate into that. She also claimed that there was no way he could have got his fingerprints onto the headboard by placing his hand there to grab a cross, because she claimed there was no cross on the wall on the other side of the bed in Sister Benz's room. However, I have crime scene photos, and I mean, there's definitely a cross there. Johnny also had a lot to say about his confession. He had already mentioned that he never confessed when he went to his arraignment, but at this point he kind of got into more details and said that he had already been sitting with police, speaking to them again at this point for about an hour, and they eventually just started saying, "You did this, didn't you?" And so he said that at that point he was just like, "Sure, put it down." And so they'd be like, "Okay, and then you did this, sure, put it down. All right, and then after that you did this, sure, put it down." So he was claiming that that was how his confession was formed and that those words were not his, and that's why ultimately at the end he refused to sign it. Also, during these multiple appeals and the habeas corpus that were filed, this was also a time to raise a lot of concerns about the trial itself, which, as I'm sure you can imagine from everything that I've told you, there was really a lot to choose from. One of the main complaints was that Johnny was denied exculpatory evidence, which is basically evidence that could prove someone else could have been responsible, and he was not. So when they did the autopsy, Dr. Erdman did the autopsy on Sister Benz. As I stated, they retrieved a semen sample. Now, Dr. Erdman ended up taking this semen sample, the entirety of it, and used it to test and see if it was semen. And after doing this, within days of Johnny being arrested, Dr. Erdman then threw the samples away. So the big issue with this is that those samples could have been used to determine blood type. While there was no DNA testing, granted it would have been great if there was, because this probably could have completely changed this case. However, unfortunately, the courts ruled that the evidence was not simply destroyed, that he was not denied exculpatory evidence, because instead the evidence was just used in the way that the pathologist felt was most beneficial. And then they said that Dr. Erdman had absolutely no obligation to preserve that evidence after using it the way that he wanted to. Now, y'all, I'm no pathologist. Surprise, I know, shocking. I'm no pathologist. However, hear me out. So according to the reports, there were multiple signs of internal and external trauma leading the pathologist to believe there was forcible rape. So it's safe to say that that sample that was taken was semen. And you could essentially prove there was a sexual assault based on the evidence that was already there, the internal damage to the vaginal cavity and external damage. So you would think that the more important and pressing matter at that point would be, okay, well, yes, she was sexually assaulted, but she was also murdered. And there was not a single stitch of biological evidence on the rest of her body other than the sample taken. Wouldn't you think that the best way to use that evidence at that point would be to find out the blood type of the attacker to then narrow down the suspect pool and rule out certain individuals? So the fact that they are trying to say that he used it in the most beneficial way possible, but knowing that there was already other evidence to support the idea there was a sexual assault and this could have been used to figure out things about the perpetrator that they would not have known otherwise. I don't understand that. And incredibly upsetting thing that happened is that Danny Hill, the DA, then went on to quote when he was asked about this, that, quote, "Based on other evidence we had at the time, we did not think that the evidence was critical. We didn't think that was any more conclusive than fingerprints or pubic hair." Now, again, this pubic hair they're claiming is consistent but is inconclusive. These fingerprints were consistent with Johnny, but there was no blood. They were not the murder weapon. So essentially there was no proof to conclusively say there that Johnny killed her. So you're trying to tell me that these two inconclusive pieces of evidence are somehow no more conclusive than the blood type of the perpetrator? I just don't understand. Ultimately, this was just totally tossed aside. This pretty large issue within the trial amongst all these other issues. And so more and more people continue to rally around Johnny and try to save his life. And it wasn't just, people that were against the death penalty or his family members. It was members of the Roman Catholic Church. It was nuns within Sister Tadea Benz's Swiss lineage. It was every single bishop in the state of California, and it was Pope John Paul II. So basically, the entirety of the Roman Catholic Church came forward and said that they did not agree with the 17-year-old kid being put to death. There was a mass statement sent to the state of Texas from every bishop in that state together that said, quote, "While we abhor the brutal murder of Sister Tadeo, we continue to be opposed to the death penalty. Our opposition to capital punishment is based on our strong belief in the inherent sacredness of human life and on our obligation to be faithful to the teaching of Jesus Christ, which calls on us for reconciliation and to forgive those who wrong us. In the case of Johnny Frank Garrett, we believe that the courts should take into consideration not only the fact that he was a juvenile at the time of the crime, but also that there is evidence not admitted in the previous court proceedings that he had suffered brain damage and was abused as a child and was addicted to drugs. He is now diagnosed as chronically psychotic." While all of this is going on, and there's all these appeals in motion, which, side note, his first appellate attorney was again assigned to him by the same judge that assigned the other attorneys that didn't do much for him. The appellate attorney apparently didn't do anything for months. Johnny could not get in touch with him. This is a sensitive time matter here. And eventually this appellate attorney quit to go and work for DA Danny Hill. So another very strange occurrence there. Finally got an appellate attorney that was trying to do something for him. He had examinations done by multiple psychologists, psychiatrists, and each and every one of them claimed that he was chronically psychotic, which, if I'm being quite frank, I'm not exactly sure what that means. If that's like an actual diagnosis or like a general diagnosis about a range of different diagnoses. They also said that he was brain damaged. He was, in fact, cognitively impaired. So this is why so many people were fighting to end the death penalty, because it was wrong. It felt very wrong. So Texas Governor Ann Richards ended up hearing these pleas from the church. The Pope spoke towards the state of Texas, saying that they needed to grant Johnny clemency. And once she got this information, Ann Richards, she ended up calling the bishop at the time, who had spent all of this time fighting for Johnny because he knew him very well. And she essentially lied to the bishop and said that she did not have the power to grant him clemency or to commute his sentence to just a life in prison sentence, which, by the way, is complete BS. She has full power to do that. But this basically showed these individuals fighting for Johnny that this was more so about other things like politics and religion, and it was having the ability to do the right things. While she did not do a lot of the things that were being asked, she did in fact grant Johnny a 30-day executive reprieve, and she did this within like an hour of his first scheduled execution. So this gave them 30 days to figure out something else to do. All right, we've already tried to say that the exculpatory evidence was withheld. I think they even came forward about the jurors. But unfortunately, the way that things played out and the way that his defense attorneys acted, essentially, there was like nothing. Essentially, they left him with no out. Because they didn't fight at all and just sat back and let these things happen and allowed these jurors on and all of that. They created an environment where everything had essentially been accepted by Johnny, and so he couldn't argue it now. He was examined by a few more mental health experts. There was a Dr. Dorothy Lewis who ended up coming to his aid. She is a forensic psychiatrist and had began a study on juveniles that had been given the death sentence because she was trying to support her theory that murderers were products of their environments, more so than born that way. And while waiting on death row, she had interviewed Johnny a few times, and there were a few strange things that made her believe that there was something else mentally going on. For instance, he spoke frequently about not being scared that he was facing the death penalty, and he wasn't scared of the death penalty because of his dead aunt Barbara, who apparently would come to his cell and speak to him while he was in his cell. She would basically tell him that he didn't need to worry about the death penalty because she would get him out of it. And for those of you who aren't like following very closely, this was not something real that was happening. This was like a delusion or something else was going on. And so when she finally was able to speak to him, she flew out to Texas. She felt that the real diagnosis was dissociative identity disorder. She claimed that Johnny told her of an alter named Aaron Shockman that was created after he was horribly attacked and beat up in the 5th grade. This altar also formed around the time that he was being prostituted by his stepfather. So she believed, and this isn't proper, but she said, quote, after interviewing him and assessing him, that, quote, Texas was about to execute a crazy man for an act committed as a crazy boy. So his lawyers took all of this information along with all of the psychiatric evaluations, all of the other evidence, basically everything they could gather possible that went wrong in this case, and they presented it to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which this was like one of the first times this had ever even, joined together to be used. And they argued that his mental state did not allow him to understand his sentence. The Supreme Court had ruled, which by the way, at the time, it was fully legal to sentence a juvenile to death. And it was also completely legal to sentence someone that was cognitively impaired, mentally handicapped. I'm not intentionally saying anything that could possibly be improper. It's just important how it's worded legally, and that's how it's worded. It was illegal to sentence them to death. However, the Supreme Court had ruled that a person who is, quote, insane, unquote, cannot comprehend a sentence as extreme as the death penalty. So this is kind of the route they were trying to go. And the court said that while he may not be fully sound of the mind, that he was still very well aware that the lethal injection needle meant that he was going to die, and that's all that they needed him to understand. So ultimately, a 17-0 vote was cast in favor of execution. And at this point, they had exhausted everything possible. And so on February 11th, 1992, at the age of 28 years old, Johnny died by lethal injection in front of his family and a bunch of journalists. To his death, he maintained his innocence. And a very important statistic that I feel like everyone needs to know, because I did not know it, when it comes to the death penalty, there's only 2% of people that maintain their innocence till death when convicted of a capital crime like this. 98% end up confessing prior to their death or at their deathbed. So either Johnny is also somehow miraculously in this 2%, or he did not commit the crime. Last meal, he asked for ice cream. And while for some reason the Texas Department of Justice claims that he denied to make a statement, like a last statement, those in the room, including his mother and multiple journalists, claimed that he repeatedly thanked his family for loving him. He told anyone that was responsible for putting him in the position he was in and sentencing him to death that they would have it coming to them. He said there was a letter that they should expect. And the last thing he said was, quote, I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me. The rest of the world can kiss my ass because I'm innocent. After his death, there was a very mixed crowd outside of the Huntsville unit. There were people chanting that there was enough blood shed, and they didn't understand how the government was okay with killing someone else. There was also a group of people that were like, finally, we feel safe. Like, this is a moment we've been waiting for, to feel like the government is actively doing something to get dangerous people off the streets. And so it was just a very mixed bag of emotions out there. And unfortunately for Johnny, it wasn't until after his death that even more information ended up coming out that pointed towards his possible innocence, and also a potentially corrupt system that put him there essentially because they needed someone to take blame. That is at least what is claimed. So during the time after his death, a lot of people became to be more aware about all of the evidence that I spoke to you guys about already that had not been shown to the jurors. There was a documentary made that was called The Last Word by Jesse Quackenbush, who is a private investigator and attorney who is working on this case diligently and with the family. And in that documentary, one of the jurors said that had he been presented a lot of that information, it probably would have made a massive, massive difference, because he even states it put in a lot of reasonable doubt. And on top of that, talking about a corrupt system, In 94, just 2 years after Johnny's death, Dr. Erdman, the pathologist, was charged with corruption. Interestingly, this wasn't really noticed until the original judge that dealt with the entire trial left and was replaced by a new one, and this new judge started noticing a whole bunch of strange things that Dr. Erdman was presenting at different trials. And on top of that, there was a family that had come forward with a pretty serious accusation. So 41-year-old Mr. Newman, I am not aware of his first name, had been found dead in his home, and Dr. Erdman was the one who performed the autopsy. Now, out of absolute nowhere, at the complete and utter surprise of his family, Dr. Erdman labeled the cause of death as a cocaine overdose. And his family was like, there's absolutely no way. Like, this completely came out of left field. Mr. Newman did not use any drugs, and it wasn't until they got the autopsy report and started to really look things over, because none of this makes sense, that they noticed a weight for Mr. Newman's spleen. And they're like, wait a minute. He had his spleen removed years prior. So they were so strongly believed something was up here to the point that they went and exhumed their loved one. And they opened the casket and immediately see that there is not a single cut mark on his body. Mr. Newman had never even had an autopsy done. So they sent him in for their own autopsy, and he did not die of a cocaine overdose. Imagine that, but of a heart attack. And so once this information came out, prosecutors and families started coming out of the woodwork saying, we also had something strange happen to our loved one. There's something going on with our autopsy. An investigation opened, and they ended up finding that Dr. Erdman had falsified at the very least 100 different autopsies, fabricated an absolute absurd amount of information within those autopsies. And at this point, Dr. Erdman had conducted over 3,000 autopsies across 41 separate jurisdictions. And so they're realizing, oh crap, we've opened a can of worms. So as a bit of an example of some of the things that Dr. Erdman was found responsible for, a human body was found in a dumpster at one point and sent in for an autopsy. And Dr. Erdman claimed that this individual had died of pneumonia. And thankfully, police had already started an investigation. They did not at all believe this was the case. And ultimately, they ended up being led to a suspect, a man that said, you know what? What actually happened is that I robbed this guy, carjacked him basically, shot him in the head multiple times, and then threw him in a dumpster. And so police are like, oh crap, he got this wrong somehow. Maybe he died with pneumonia, but we need to go and check his head for these bullet wounds. We have to get the evidence we need to charge this guy. And when they go to Dr. Erdman to be like, hey, where is this dude's head? Dr. Erdman's like, oh, I lost it. And so they were never able to charge this man. On top of that, there was also a father that had been wrongfully charged in the murder of his son. According to Dr. Erdman, this infant had come in after passing away, and he claimed this child died from blunt force trauma to his abdomen. So this man was devastated, went to trial, was convicted of this, and ultimately it was found that there had been no blow to the stomach, that this infant had actually died from an accidental drowning, which is what this man had claimed the entire time he was being accused of the crime. And these are just a handful of examples out of tons of them. So one after another, bodies were exhumed thanks to all these questionable things that families and prosecutors found that Dr. Erdman had presented to trials, had just presented through these death certificates, autopsy reports, and it was just staggering how much he had messed up. According to what has been said, he just cut corners for the heck of it. He would not weigh organs, so he just put down like random numbers. One prosecutor claimed that they noticed something strange when a lot of the different autopsy reports Dr. Erdman did for them had like the same blood volume for every single person. So just a bunch of stuff like that. There were multiple bodies exhumed where no autopsy had ever been done. So many criminal cases where claims were made to support the prosecution. And it was just an absolute freaking nightmare. And a lot of people just said he was a strange guy in general because he would just like hand people that were in there with him like body parts, would bring his children to work with him. He kept like his own personal fridge filled with jars of like preserved dead animals. And one thing that everyone also seemed to say is that he so badly wanted to be a part of the police. Like he wanted to be one of the guys. And so a lot of people believed that in some of these cases, it could even go as deep as corruption, that he wasn't just doing stuff for the fun of it, which he definitely was doing in some of these cases, but some worried that he may have done things because a prosecutor paid him to, or because a police officer paid him to, or there's literally no telling, honestly. And so he ended up pleading no contest to 6 felonies and was sentenced to 10 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. And so you would think that this would warrant someone looking into the fact that evidence was allegedly thrown away after being fully used up during Johnny Frank Garrett's case. However, it seems, understandably, I will say understandably, that the main focus and the first thing that they wanted to do was potentially save the lives of people who had been wrongfully accused because of Dr. Erdman's evidence that were still sitting on death row. At this point, Johnny Frank Garrett had already received the lethal injection. He was no longer alive. So I think his case was just not a priority. I honestly don't know if they ever looked into it to see if anything that Dr. Erdman did could have impacted the trial. I mean, this brings up not just questions of, he throws away this sample, the one biological sample they have within days of Johnny Frank Garrett's arrest, but then I go to thinking about, was there other evidence on the body that wasn't collected? Like, were there things that he didn't write down? Was there stuff that he lied about? There's all these people that are somehow traced back to Danny Hill, this man who had just been elected, made all these promises. Did someone in the woodworks hire Dr. Erdman to get rid of evidence? There's just a lot of questions, and I quite frankly don't think it is out of the realm of possibilities to believe that any of those things could have happened. And then 10 years later in 2004, something pretty huge happened. So despite the fact that, again, these cases seem to be clumped together in the beginning, now I will say no one ever directly said these cases for sure are connected. They just said they were very similar. They were looking into it. It doesn't seem like anyone actually looked into it, and that's my problem. There are a lot of people that have claimed while covering this and looking into this that police said for a fact the cases are connected, which they didn't. What they did specifically say is they were going to investigate them separately and together to find if there was a connection. And so you would assume that once they found Johnny Frank Garrett as being responsible for the murder of Sister Tadea Benz, that they would then send all of the evidence from Narnie Bryson's case, all of the evidence from Johnny, to see if this could also solve Narnie Bryson's case. But they didn't. Everyone just stopped investigating Narnie Bryson's case. And this is incredibly strange to me. And so all of these years, there's just nothing being done until 2004, something absolutely random happens. Now, I've been seeing this reported 2 separate ways. I have seen that an investigator decided to relook into all the evidence. At this point, DNA testing is available. There's lots of other, advanced technology that was not available at the time of Narnie Bryson's murder or at the time of this trial. But I've also seen that it was like a random hit on CODIS. But regardless, they had a DNA match. So according to one article that I've seen that to me seems the most plausible, people were looking into this evidence from Narnie's case all these years later, and they found that there was a sheet that had been submitted to the FBI. It had been under Narnie Bryson's body at the time of her murder. And while the FBI did not test a stain they found on the sheet, they did make a note that they believe that it was potentially semen. And so now that they're looking into this, they're seeing potential evidence that's still there, has remained untouched, and they can test it for DNA. Sure enough, it was a semen sample, so a DNA profile was extracted and put into CODIS, and it came back to, and I feel like this warrants a frickin' drum roll, Leoncio Perez Rueda. The same man that had been caught 2 weeks after Narnie's murder, naked outside of a woman's window, fully plotting on getting in. The same man that lived on the same street as the other woman on Halloween that was broken into and sexually assaulted in the exact same neighborhood just down the road from where the murder and sexual assault happened from Sister Tadea Benz. And he was currently incarcerated in New Mexico. And his history in Cuba was that he was one of those 20,000 criminals / patients have been sent to the United States. His criminal history in Cuba was that he was in prison for, you guessed it, sexually assaulting and killing people. Leoncio had already been questioned about the murder of Narnie Bryson 2 weeks after it happened, and now he was formally being charged all these years later in her murder. They are saying that the hairs match. They are saying that the DNA matches, specifically the only sample that was left behind, which was semen. So the same case that perfectly seems to match the murder and sexual assault of Sister Tadea Benz, the black curly hairs, the one semen sample left behind, they're now charging this man for it. And so everyone's like, now wait a minute. Does this make it possible that you guys had the wrong guy? Could you have killed Johnny Frank Garrett when he wasn't responsible? And so right away, Jesse Quackenbush, who was looking into trying to clear Johnny's name for his family, who said there's no way, we want him to, be free of this. He shows up at the moment that Leoncio is extradited back to Texas from New Mexico, and he sits down and questions him. And all of this interview is on the Last Word documentary website. You can see what Leoncio says. And what he told Jesse and what he told police seem to be two completely different stories. So police said that Leoncio first denied having anything to do with the murder of Narnie Bryson, but once they said, we've got your DNA, this, that, and the other, he's like, all right, fine, I committed the crime. And he ended up ultimately taking a plea deal, which got him, get this, he should have been facing the same punishment as Johnny Frank Garrett, capital murder, death sentence. He was offered a plea deal that would give him 45 years in prison. And there's not just that, like this was a good deal for him. So I'm trying to figure out what he did in return. The plea deal also included that he would not be charged with any further crimes, which is very interesting to me. So what he ends up telling Jesse, he was actually participating in this crime against Narnie with his friend Fernando Flores. So he claims that Fernando Flores essentially brought him along to this attack on Narnie Bryson. And he claimed that his fingerprints and all that were on her because Fernando made him put his hands on her, took Leoncio's hands and put them around her neck. Basically claims that Fernando made him put his DNA and things all over Narnie Bryson. He claimed that it was actually a telephone cord that had been used to kill Narnie, and that Fernando made him put his hands on it and then made him put it over her neck. He also claimed that his semen ended up on Narnie because Fernando forced him to put it there, which is interesting. But basically he was like, oh yeah, Fernando made me do this. He put my hands here. He lifted my right arm and did this. And so to me, I think it's a load of BS. But he mentions during all of this, without even being prompted, that Fernando also mentioned something about beating up a nun really bad. So he even brings up the murder of Sister Tadea Benz and blames this on Fernando as well. And he says that Fernando never said if he sexually assaulted her, but he thinks that he did. And Fernando never said that he killed her, but he thinks that he did. He even mentions the white shirts and claims that they were a gift to him from Sister Tadea Benz. He claims that you can see them in all of the pictures that the detective showed him previously when being questioned. And he even goes on to say that his hair had been taken in 1981. His fingerprints had been taken in 1981. Despite Fernando's being sent off to the FBI lab to be compared to Sister Benz's crime scene, Leoncio's was never sent off. They had this other potential suspect and they never actually formally ruled him out, and then ended up charging someone else entirely. And so there's a huge chance that that other set of fingerprints in that room could match back to Leoncio. There's a pretty good chance that those hairs found in her mouth and all over Sister Tadea Benz could belong to Leoncio. And so after all this information was gathered, everyone's just in absolute shock. So Jesse Quackenbush ended up sending a rather large list of essentially demands to the DA as well as the city of Amarillo, like the police chief, basically saying, like, we want to retest the evidence that you have still in terms of Johnny Frank Garrett's case. Ultimately, DA Rebecca King ended up responding back to this, saying that she has absolutely no custody of any of the items that Jesse Quackenbush is looking for, as in all of the evidence, calls his allegations unsubstantiated, and basically says that there's nothing that she's going to do or can do, and he needs to pursue this through appropriate legal proceedings. And the city of Amarillo ended up responding back as well. They also have stated that they have no idea what evidence still even remains. In Jesse's letter, as well as a letter that was sent by Johnny's mother, they threatened to sue, like a wrongful death suit, to the city and the DA and like all of these different things because of what had happened. And they basically said, you know, if you don't provide these pieces of evidence, or at least preserve them if you do still have them, so we can have further litigation to try to test them properly, again, we'll like have a wrongful death suit. And the city ended up responding back saying, you've threatened us with a wrongful death suit, and we just want to let you know that now we are going to sue you if you sue us. So essentially everyone's saying that there's nothing that can really be done in terms of clearing Johnny's name if he is potentially innocent. They cannot touch the evidence. No one will hand over what is left or even let them know what has been kept. They were also told that after someone is executed, they have no obligation then either to retain any of that evidence. I just personally don't understand how there is just not enough here to question a lot of things. On top of all the other evidence that was brought up, it ended up being found out that police had gone and gathered every single bit of clothing possible from Johnny Garrett's room, and they sent all of that off for testing. There was not a single piece of clothing that was found to have any sort of biological matter on it. Also, since whoever did this came in through a window, they searched everything for glass. There was no glass. The one thing that they did notice, however, that all of Johnny's clothes seemed to be just coated in animal hair because he had dogs and cats. So you would think that they would see if there were any animal hairs present at all in Sister Tadea Benz's room to prove that he was there, maybe on that white t-shirt that was found, but there weren't any. So that brings into question, again, is he really the right guy? And on top of that, there was apparently blood on the exit door beside the windows that had been broken into. And so the reason this is kind of important is because it's believed that this could have actually been how the perpetrator left. And the blood on the door frame could possibly actually be from the perpetrator themselves. But for some reason, that blood wasn't tested. Again, nobody knows if anyone still has it. And it also completely negates the alleged confession that the police claim that Johnny Garrett gave. In that confession, he states that he entered in through the window and left the same way. If that were the case and Johnny was in fact the one involved, how on earth would blood have gotten on that door frame? And on top of that, crawling out through the window, he would have gotten glass on his clothes, and there were no pieces of glass in his clothes. And there would have been glass dragged out of the window into the dirt underneath of it, but there was no evidence of that. So all the evidence does support someone broke in through the window and went out a different way. And so you guys, you can just see how there's so much frustration here and confusion. And Amarillo and everyone involved continues to state that if there's anything valid that's ever brought forward, they will look into this. And so my biggest issue is that there's so much information out there to support why it seems something went wrong here, but I just feel like there's nothing that's being provided back to prove to me that the prosecution actually was able to bring forward a good case, that like any of this could be explained any other way. And so I understand why so many people are out there still asking questions. When you say that you've already proven a murder by fingerprints on things that are not the murder weapon, and that's literally the only thing that you have, and a confession that wasn't signed, to me, that's not a solid case. And so I don't understand why the DA's office and all of them are so hell-bent on saying that they had a solid case. At the same time, they like have not come forward to support anything that they did any of the evidence that they had to calm down these questions that people have. They so quickly believed the confession from Leoncio that he did in fact kill Narnie Bryson, but when he's captured on video saying that Fernando Flores had confessed to him of being the one to attack the nun, like, why haven't they looked into that? There's so many times where things have been presented to me that should have caused them to stop and question and look into things, and they haven't. So their words and their actions just don't seem to be meeting up. And I feel like it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that. So this case has just absolutely fascinated so many people because a lot of people believe there was no justice for Sister Tadea Benz and that a 17-year-old cognitively impaired young man was put to death for a crime that he did not commit. And there's just all of this conspiracy linked to it. On top of that, he sent letters out prior to his death to those involved that seemed to essentially be like him casting a spell on people. I don't want to reread it just because it's incredibly dark and this video is already heavy enough. And it's also something that's like a little bit, touch and go. So again, that's out there if you want to see it. What's kind of freaky about this is that within years of him telling all of these people that, if you played a part in sentencing me to death, an innocent man to death, like, you will end up paying for what you have done. And when I tell you within those years, over a dozen people in connection to the case died, I am not joking. I've never ever seen anything like it. There was a juror that fell down the stairs and died. The woman from NBC that captured that devastating photo of his mom in a private bathroom stall was in a freak plane crash. The relative to the judge that was one of the punishment witnesses, his son died of a stray bullet when he was just a baby, like shortly after this. Multiple judges and prosecutors, I think every single lawyer that presented him except for like one ended up with leukemia. Pancreatic cancer showed up in 2 people involved. There were multiple suicides, including Danny Hill, the DA, the snitch/informant. This whole community has just gone through it. And I'm very interested to see what you guys have to say about this because it's just wild to me. I could not believe that I had never heard of this before and that there weren't more people talking about it because it's very clear that there were many missteps taken and that people just don't want to admit it. And I'm not saying whether he was innocent or guilty or, whatever, but even if you totally take that out of the equation, everything in this case was done wrong from start to finish. So I definitely think it's a big conversation starter. It's something that a lot of people can learn from. So on that note, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you guys again for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.